Hello, everyone, and I'm sorry that this is coming to you so late. It's been such a crazy busy time, but this is your lecture about narrative voice. It's called The Work of Fiction, Narrative Voice, and Owned Voices. And this will be available on your Blackboard page as well, the PowerPoints that you can click through and look at some of the sources I've used. I'm just going to introduce very quickly some ideas about how fiction works in the reader's brain so that we can get an idea for our responsibilities when we're thinking about this kind of issue. Fiction provides excellent training for young people in developing and practicing empathy and theory of mind. Now, that's a Cambridge University study, particularly about young but this has been collaborated in later studies featuring readers of other age groups. So reading fiction helps us to develop new ideas of empathy and new theories for how it might feel to be other people. And the reason that this works is very interesting, and it has to do with how fiction works in the reader's brain. Now, bear with me. This is a little bit freaky, okay? If you are sitting in a chair and watching a film about somebody running, your brain thinks you're sitting in a chair and watching a film, duh. But if you're sitting in a chair and reading a book about somebody running, your brain thinks you're running. And this is because of the engagement that the reader has in creating half the fictional narrative in their brain while they're reading our words on the paper. Now, this slide talks about fiction and brain development, but this isn't just brain development in young people or in children or adolescents. It also has a lot of power in how adults can change and grow. And this is based on ideas about action. We used to think that that our neocortexes decided how we would act in a given situation, that we would decide the correct form of action, and then we would perform that act. Now we know that it doesn't really work that way. Our stimulus to act and our decision to act in a certain way generally is done right back here in our reptilian brain and the areas where our reptilian mammalian brains interact. Now, this part of our brain has very little quality control. An action is deemed successful if we did it before and we did not die. So if you've ever been in an argument and really didn't want to say something and ended up saying that thing, or if you've had a hard time breaking a habit, that's because our ability to act is stored back here in files that have very little quality control, and we only have this momentary ability to abort that action when it passes through our neocortex before we actually perform the action. Now, what does this have to do with fiction? The thing is, what we've discovered is that when we read fiction, we make memories other than our life memories. So we have these actions are formed from memories. And because we feel like we're living these narratives, we have other files inserted in our brains of other possible actions. And reading good fiction, uplifting fiction, gives us better understandings of possible actions, and that increases our ability to act effectively. And that helps us construct narratives of self as well. A lot of this research comes from looking at prison populations and looking at recidivism rates and the effect of imagining different selves and how that helps prisoners stay out of prison. If you think about the narrative of conversion, is a really good short-term solution to a new narrative of self. I was a bad person before, then I had this religious conversion, and now I'm a good person. It's a fairly static one, and in a lot of people it doesn't allow for any backsliding or new stimulus, and so sometimes it doesn't work very well in the long term. The better a prisoner is at being able to understand how narrative works, to engage with narrative as a thought process, and rewrite their own life story, the more likely they are to stay out of jail in the future. So we can see how important our work can be in society, and in particular for our individual readers. It's not just us learning from neuropsychology. Neuropsychology learns from us as well. And here's some interesting ideas about what an author does and how we work in terms of memory retrieval, visualization, future thinking, and how we tend to distill vast amounts of data in order to produce simulacrums of experience for the reader. And perhaps some of before we leave this idea, I just want to also explore a couple of genres. Historical fiction allows us to recognize different outlooks, and it is an essential historical skill. But it is a minefield of hard questions about the responsibility novelists have to the historical record. And here we're looking at how science fiction works with a greater society, particularly with engineering, and by helping engineers imagine a world in which their new ideas become widely used in society. And science fiction can also set the agenda for our future. I always say that I am teaching my students to become ready for the future as seen in Star Trek Next Generation, when we don't have to worry about our material worth, when everybody is fed and there is more or less universal peace, and then we're wondering what we're going to do with our lives. That's the future I'm trying to get you ready for. So all of that is quite a big responsibility, isn't it? That we represent the world, that we represent the people inside of our world in such a way that we are providing good insights into experience. And yet we have quite a bit of trouble with this. I'm just going to show you this particular slide. That last year only 10% of the children's books published featured a Black or other ethnic minority child. And in literary fiction, this is what Bernardine Evaristo has to say, that we are pretty invisible. So I want you to stop the video right after this little exercise and just think about the worlds that you're presenting to the reader. I want you to think about, how many of your characters are of different ethnic minorities and what those minorities or majorities are. I want you to think about how many of your characters are queer. I want you to think about your characters in terms of class. I want you to think about how you want to represent those worlds. It's very easy to kind of forget that even historical worlds had very varied populations. All right, so let's assume that you've thought about all that and you're either on track or you've resolved to change, to up your game, and to make sure that there is more representation in your fiction of people who are non-white, non-cis, non-middle class. Okay, that's fantastic and well done. And, welcome to the club. And that really needs to be done by every writer in the UK and every writer in the world today. But it's very difficult to do this successfully. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how that works. Firstly, if you are a white writer who lives in a white culture and has a fairly subscribed friendship base, it might be really difficult for you to write any other kinds of characters, especially in terms of some of your main characters. And that means that we end up with narratives where the white characters have agency and are doing things, and the black and ethnic minority characters, people of color, the queer characters, etc., are in the background, just watching the white middle classes characters act. So that's dangerous, isn't it? But we also have to be careful that we're not appropriating other people's, identity, existence, life experience in order to make our own narratives more relevant. So we have to think about that as well. And this can mean that we have a kind of catch-22 situation where if we represent its cultural appropriation, and if we don't represent, it's whiting out our narratives. And by the way, I am fully aware that I'm saying we in terms of our class. And I know that there are people of color in our class, but I am also aware that these problems don't go away just because of your own cultural identity, and they can be almost as difficult for people of color to navigate as they can be for the white students. So I'm going to say we. I'm going to let you think about any areas that you might not be representing on your own. I'm just going to say that we have this duty and we have this problem. And this is a very inclusive we. I think that our identities both strengthen our narratives and also put a little fence around them if we're not really careful. So what do we do in this case? And to answer that, I'm going to look at Andrew Bennett and Nicholas Royle's An Introduction to Literature, Criticism, and Theory. This is, Andrew Bennett is the head of research at Bristol English, and this is an excellent text, and it's available online in the Bristol University Library. And they bring up this idea of double voicing. There's a couple of ideas here I want to introduce you to. And again, if you're a keen critic, you can always look at this chapter and look at additional reading. The question of voice is never simple, even or perhaps especially when it appears to be. Second, literary texts not only present voices, but have things to say about what voices are and how we might or might not hear them. I think the easiest way to kind of get our heads around this is to look at the Evaristo. So let's do that now. In this book, Evaristo uses a sinuous third-person voice that slides closer and further away from the various characters and offers insights into how they think and feel, but doesn't do this consistently. And the voice also seems to have a very clear kind of sense of boundaries. And I want to just look at that for a moment. I particularly want you to look at Megan, who becomes Morgan, and how their voice is portrayed by Evaristo. So if you could look at the Megan voice on page 324 and 325, and then look at Morgan's voice on page 334 and 335, 10 pages apart. If you'll notice, once you've looked at those, The Megan voice, Evaristo gets much more into her head. There's lots of more thoughts and feels in this element than there is in the next element, where mainly what we see about Morgan is based on what Morgan has observed other people in Morgan's reactions of other people to them. On page 336, there's a suspected, and on page 338, there is a felt. But most of this section Morgan is seen in relation to other people, and we observe kind of Morgan's thoughts and feelings by what they notice. So what's happened is that Evaristo, who has felt confident in portraying Megan up to this point of transition, then pulls slightly back narratively in presenting Morgan as somebody that is a little more outside of her own experience, and she feels a little less confident, a little less comfortable about appropriating Morgan's interiority. It's a really interesting narrative trick, and I want you to look at those very carefully when you can. And that idea of double voicing is particularly interesting when you have a very strong narrator. Because even if you're using a first-person narrator, you're not able to step away from also being the authorial voice. And at some points, that authorial voice is a little bit breaking through often and mediates how we're going to read the narrative voice. So I think that when you think about double voicing, you think about what you've got control over, perhaps not that control in your first draft, but certainly something that you have control of when you start to edit and you start to think about what are the thoughts in the back of these observations that I've made here. And are they the thoughts that I would have if I took time to really think about what I was saying? Places that you can look at this is when you look at genders, when you look at relationships, look to see, what assumptions that narrative voice has, and whether that's the character's narrative voice or the character of the narrative voice, or whether that's your own assumptions that are breaking through and perhaps narrowing who's allowed to be in your fictional universe, for example. This is another extract from that chapter on narrative voice in the Bennett and Royal. And they're talking about polyphony and multiplicity. And you can read more about them, again, if you have a look at the chapter yourself, or if you do some of the additional reading in that chapter. There is a difference and a multiplicity within every voice. Any one voice is in fact made up of multiple voices. There's difference and polyphony within every voice. An author or poet is always a sort of ghostly sight for a gathering of voices. Now that's really interesting. And of course, that gathering of ghostly voices includes all the people that we've ever read, because their constructions and their phrases come back to us when we're reaching for a way to describe things. So we contain everybody we've read, which in my case looks like far too much Terry Pratchett when I sit at this particular seat. And also contains the narrative voice, our own voice. So please, be aware that you are multitudes whenever you're constructing a narrative, and that you don't want to try to hone all that out of your writing, and you'll make it very flat indeed. And I love this final quote here from Wallace Stevens. When the mind is like a hall in which thought is like a voice speaking, the voice is always that of someone else. And that someone else is probably better than we are, and just as human beings. If you remember when we were talking about how neuroscience learns from creative writing, and how an author is a distillation of culture, of reading, of their experiences and their thoughts. As authors, we are probably much better people than we are as human beings, especially since we can edit our work. So inclusivity in narrative, in narrative voice is, I think, about enlarging that hall of our minds and using the full flexibility of our authorial voices. Now, everybody's hall is going to be different, and everybody's voices will flex in some directions better than they will in others, very much depending on who we are as people and our identity and our experiences. If we are distillations, we are unique distillations, and the people that we can represent successfully will be different for every person. But still, we want to think about the assumptions that our narrative voice is holding, and who that person is that is speaking, and how we can make them speak to and for as many people as possible without flexing it until it breaks. So I think this is more about enlarging that hall of our minds, and less about becoming too tokenistic in, saying, have I got this person? Have I got that person in my narrative? It's using the narrative voice to distill your thoughts about the world you live in. And if you have a nice, large hall, then your narrative voice will be ready to do the work of fiction for as many people as possible. I hope that's useful. Bye.